Hi, this is Will Riley, and I'm going to be doing my presentation today on the podcast advantage, how companies can use podcasts to gain a competitive advantage. Today we're going to start out by briefly going over the timeline of podcasting, and then we're going to move on to some trends and statistics, and then finally we're going to go over some case studies on how current companies are using podcasting to leverage their business, and we'll finish up by I'll pose some questions on how you think, now that you know all this information about podcast, how you think businesses could use them, maybe how they already do use them, some other examples, stuff like that. So here you can see, a podcast is essentially just radio on demand. In 2000, the RSS feed was converted to allow audio by David Weiner and Adam Curry. A lot of people consider them, kind of the architects of podcasting. In 2001, the iPod was invented by Apple. Now, this is important because this was the first time, even though it wasn't the first MP3 player, this was the first time where the question was posed, how do we get radio content onto iPads? The term podcast is actually a combination of the words broadcast and iPod. In 2003, the first subscribable podcast was produced for Harvard Berkman Center by journalist Christopher Lydon. He called it audio blogging and used it for in-depth interviews. His first podcast was called Open Source, and that program is still running to this day. In 2004, podcast was added to the dictionary, and I think once you make it in the dictionary, you're going in the right direction. 2005, Apple added podcast to iTunes. In 2006, one of the most popular radio shows of all time, produced by NPR, This American Life, became available on iTunes for free. In 2007, the iPhone was invented. We'll see this later, but a huge amount of consumers for podcasts are iPhone users. Despite there being half as many iPhone users compared to Android, iPhones outpace Android 5-1 as far as how podcasts are consumed. Flash forward to 2014, Apple reaches 1 billion podcast subscribers. And then this was bumped later in 2014 by the launch of the critically acclaimed Serial. Serial was a This American Life spinoff, and if you do any research on podcasting, you'll see a 38% increase in searches for the term podcast. This is known as the Serial effect. To put it in perspective, This American Life took 4 years to reach 1 million downloads per episode. Serial took 4 weeks to reach that level. Here you'll see two graphs of who's actually listening to these podcasts. Two that I think are interesting. One is the gender breakdown. It's pretty even. So men are about 56% of podcast consumers, with women at 44%. So pretty much right down the middle. And another interesting thing I saw was the average household income. So the people that are listening to podcasts seem to be a little bit wealthier than your standard U.S. population over here by about 10% on the end. How we're listening to it. So this is important, and I touched on it briefly, but as smartphone consumption rises and smartphone usage rises, so should the amount of people that are listening to podcasts. As you can see here, people overwhelmingly listen to podcasts and overwhelmingly subscribe to podcasts on their smartphone or tablet or portable device. Right now, about 55% of the United States uses or has access to a smartphone. And so as that number continues to rise, we should also see the rise in the number of people that are listening to podcasts. So now we're going to go into our case studies here. We're going to use the activewear companies Nike, Patagonia, and Lululemon. I thought this was nice because all three of them are, like I said, activewear retailers, but they all kind of have their own niche. Nike's more of a team and sports-oriented company. Patagonia is kind of, adventure, camping, and travel. And Lululemon is, yoga and athleisure type. So they're all activewear, but they all have their own niche. So first we're going to go over Nike, which I call product-driven podcasting. In product-driven podcasting, you're going to see Nike focus on the story of, one of their actual products. In this case, the Nike Kobe Bryant basketball shoes, the Kobe Bryant 10s. It was produced, written, recorded, distributed on Nike's website. The demographic these are people that either own these shoes, want to own these shoes, are going to own these shoes in the future, any type of, sneakerhead demographic. This is essentially just a 15-minute commercial on the Kobe Bryant 10s and how they came to fruition. The process was entirely free. Kobe Bryant and their designer were already under contract. And this kept the cost extremely low for creating this, other than the hours it took for, these two people to create this. So let's go ahead and listen to the beginning just so you have a feel for what the start of this sounded like.
They've redefined over the... Welcome to Prototype, a podcast from Nike about the inside story behind the Kobe 10. In the history of athlete-designer collaborations, Michael Jordan's work with Tinker Hatfield is perhaps the most famous. But there's another duo whose work is just as impressive: Kobe Bryant and Eric Avar. Over the course of a decade, they've redefined how signature shoes come to life, revived the low top, and won multiple championships and gold medals. Or at least Kobe has. With the Kobe 10...
So here, you can hear they're going to talk about the Nike Kobe 10 basketball shoe. Hence, a product-driven podcast. Next, we have Lululemon. Here, Lululemon delivers a yoga and meditation podcast, practices that don't directly relate to the company as a brand or particular product, but they provide, a connection from their company's mission to something that will, that supports and bolsters that mission. So the 1 week meditation challenge podcast by Lululemon gave listeners the ability to practice their yoga and meditation on their own time by listening to a podcast that Lululemon produced. I thought it was great that they had an executive of the company narrate, which really put a voice to this brand. For those of you who might not know, Lululemon really prides itself on being a grassroots, local, worldwide corporation. Even though this podcast, as I mentioned, isn't directly related to, a specific type of yoga pant or shirt, in fact, it doesn't get mentioned at all. It empowers customers and potential customers to live the lifestyle that will eventually lead to them needing or wanting activewear. Most importantly, what I think is clever about this campaign is if you enjoy the 1 week meditation challenge, which is posted on Lululemon's website, you're going to continually come back to their website. And if you already own Lululemon, you're going to be just one click away from new product. And if you've never tried it, you're always going to be tempted. This is where you're going to get your information. It's where you're going to get your exercises. Why not try out some of the things that they have to offer? It also builds a lot of loyalty and a non-monetized relationship with anyone who tunes in, which is similar to me, I saw a correlation between this and the way that Apple has built a really loyal fan base in our Apple case study. Which showed that, if you build a loyal consumer base, you're going to have long-term financial success. Patagonia. So I call this partnership-based. So Patagonia teamed up with one of their ambassadors, Fitz Cahill, who runs an outdoor media company called Duct Tape Then Beer. And they created together the Dirtbag Diaries. You can find the Dirtbag Diaries on Patagonia's website, as well as on traditional podcast spaces like iTunes or Spotify. The combination of brand and mission podcasting, is kind of where I see partnership podcasting coming in. It's not quite, not brand, product podcasting. It's not quite product podcasting because it doesn't mention, a specific type of Patagonia gear to buy. But it's also not quite as loosely connected as mission-based, which doesn't push any product or even the company name, but it's sort of a service for you to be in the mindset of that company. Here, Patagonia clearly is represented. They want you to know they're involved, but they're not pushing a certain backpack or shoe or what have you. Another impressive part about this is it received critical acclaim. The content was so well received. It constantly floats in and out of the top 100. And interestingly enough is you'll see it advertised on things like Outside Magazine and National Geographic on podcasts to listen to. Let's go ahead and listen to the beginning of this podcast, and you can really hear, how it would appeal to people who are interested.
Of course, like every other teenage kid, I had no idea what I wanted to do with my life. When I was 16 years old, I took off and drove across the country to Wyoming, went into the Wind River Range, and discovered mountains.
In 1973, Yvon Chouinard founded Patagonia.
I never wanted to be a businessman. All I wanted to do was do my craft and climb mountains. So then I had to figure out a way to where I was going to be a businessman, but I was going to do it completely on my own terms.
Build the best product, cause no unnecessary harm, inspire and implement solutions to the environmental crisis. Join us at Patagonia.com.
That's how every episode starts. You can see this was episode 113. And then, it goes on to not mention Patagonia much after that. It really just talks about, in this case, it's a story. They talk about their outdoor adventures, the wild things that happen when you're in the wild. It starts out with that quote from Yvon Chouinard. So you know that this is a Patagonia sponsored story. But to me, it feels a little different than sponsorship. I didn't want to call this sponsorship podcasting because the main goal why Patagonia is involved in this doesn't seem to push product. It doesn't seem for you to fall in love with Patagonia. The podcast is really the centerpiece of this partnership. You almost never hear specific products mentioned. And that way it's similar to the mission style of podcasting. So now that we've gone over those three, I think there's a few different strategies and alternative applications that podcasts could have on companies. I think it'd be really interesting to see a completely company-driven podcast that's, weekly or monthly. Stories are the advertisement, just like we saw in the Kobe Bryant one. If you can come up with compelling enough content for people to listen, you'll have, not just advertisements that you don't have to pay for, but that advertisements that people seek out. And I also wanted us to start thinking about possible uses in different fields. What if doctors could prescribe their patients, nutrition podcast or exercise podcast? Finance. Here you can see Goldman Sachs has kind of a mission-based podcast where they talk about different financial aspects, but they don't particularly push Goldman Sachs. Education, there's an infinite amount of knowledge in podcasts, from astrology to different languages and what have you. I think it'd be interesting for research centers, such as, what if I imagine a cancer research center telling these, heartwarming stories, which then led me to think of my personal field of fundraising and advancement. What if we use podcasting to get our donors to feel more connected and more in the know, which is going to lead to more consistent donations and higher levels. So thanks for listening. Here are kind of the questions I think that you guys could start to comment on, and I'd love to hear your opinions. I want to see, how do you guys see companies leveraging the technology of podcasting to further their mission? Maybe some that you've heard of, or maybe you have some ideas of ways that it's not being done yet. Are there any drawbacks or advantages that we didn't discuss? And then finally, do you know of any other styles of podcasts that company-driven podcasts might fall into? So today we went over the product-based podcasting of Nike, the mission-based podcasting of Lululemon, and the partnership podcasting of Patagonia. To your right, you'll see the top 10 current podcasts in the world. I really encourage you to listen to some if you haven't. And thanks for listening. Looking forward to hearing what you guys have to say.